So today, to start our discussion for the week of Menachos, we'll talk about Kmitza and exactly how to fulfill Kmitza and what is Kmitza. In the Hakdama of the Mesifta, you'll find it on page Yud Aleph. And we'll have to fill in some of the other blanks, the missing blanks with regard to other dimensions of what we call Matan, Shemen, Ulavona, Blila, and we'll come back to that in Mitzvah Shem. But first, let's talk a little bit about Kmitza. First of all, Kmitza actually can be broken down into 4 different avodos that parallel the 4 avodos of a zebach. So in Zvachim we have, of course, Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, and Zrika. And this is paralleled by Kmitza. Kmitza corresponds to Shchita. And he tells you here in the footnote that just like Shchita separates the dam, removes the dam of, let's say, whatever the carbon is, the dam that has to be Ola al Mizbeach from the rest of the basar. So too, in the case of Kmitza, we're going to separate that part of the soles that goes on to the Mizbeach from the part that's eaten by the Kohanim, what we call the Shirayim. So the parallel here between Shchita and Kmitza is a very precise parallel. The similarity, the analogy is very telling, because basically as a result of the Shchita, we're separating the dam from the basar. Shchita is going to facilitate the next stage in the avodah, which is Kabbalah Hadam, and that dam is going to go on the Mizbeach. And that separates the basar from the dam. The basar itself, with the exception of carbon olam, will be eaten by Zichrei Kahuna, or possibly even by the Bailim who are not Kohanim. But in any event, what we're doing is we're separating that part which has to go exclusively to the Mizbeach from that which goes to Achila of the Kohanim. And the same is true exactly in the case of Kmitza in Menachos. The purpose of the Kmitza is to separate that part of the soles, which is going to go on the Mizbeach, like the dam in the case of Shchita, from the Shirayim, the balance of the soles, which is going to be eaten by the Kohen. Then we move on to stage number 2. And that's called Matan HaKometz B'Kli. We're going to take that Kometz after he does Kmitza, and we're going to put it into a Kli, and then from that Kli we'll go on. And that's exactly parallel to the Dam of Shchita, which now we're makabel the Dam in a Kli. So that the Kabbalas HaKometz in a Kli parallels Kabbalas Hadam B'Kli. Next, we have Halacha. We take the Kometz that's now in the Kli over to the Mizbeach. That, of course, is identical with Halacha Sadam. And finally, Haktaras HaKometz, which is parallel to Zrika Sadam. And just like Zrika Sadam, the dam goes on to the Mizbeach, so too the Kometz goes on to the Mizbeach. It's going to be burnt on the Mizbeach. Now, there are other avodos that we're going to discuss beyond Kometz, beyond Kmitza. Not all menachos will require this, but there's something called Tnufa and Hagasha. So again, we're introducing new concepts, new terminology to the world of menachos. Tnufa, what does Tnufa mean? And just like we have, this reminds me so much of the lulav, that we have the lulav which we take up and down in all the 4 directions, and that's called nanuim. So we have something very, very similar. Again, that the analogy is mine. I mean, in the case of a kometz. HaKohen omed mi mizrach u'mizbeach. He's on the eastern side of the mizbeach. U'molech u'mevias hamincha, and lifting up the mincha in arba ruchos shamayim. That means north and south and east and west, and up and down, lamala ulamata. So we have 6 dimensions or parts of Tnufa. And all this is codified by the Mishnah in Menachos on Daf Samach Aleph. Now, in the footnote here, he mentions the following. He says, Molech umevi, what is the symbolism here of all these movements of the mincha? L'misha haruchos shelo. Right, all 4 directions, north, east, south, and west, belong to the Almighty. So this is an act which is a manifestation or a demonstration of the fact that the mincha belongs to God. It's designated for Shamayim. And mala umorid lefisha Shamayim ve'ha'aretz shelo. The heavens and the earth belong to God. Molech umevi. There's another alternative explanation for why we take the mincha and we move it in all 4 directions. Kedei latzar ruchos ros. There are bad winds that can be very disastrous to the, we're talking about an agricultural society. And the ruchos come from north, east, south, west, and they're very dangerous. So we want to ward off these bad winds. Umayla umorid keneged kidei latzar tlolim ro'en. So the dew comes down from the heavens and it lands on the ground, and there's dew that is beneficial, and then there's dew that is destructive. So we want to make sure that we're praying that the dew should be helpful, beneficial. So that's with regard to Tnufa. And as we said, there's another avoda, which is called Haggasha. Now, as a general rule, we're going to have both Tnufa and Haggasha, and the sequence is exactly that. Tnufa first, and then Haggasha second. However, when I say that's when we have both Tnufa and Haggasha, not all menachos require Tnufa and Haggasha. In fact, the general rule is, we'll see some of the exceptions, is that a mincha requires Haggasha and not Tnufa. For example, in a minchas yachid, if it's my personal vow or pledge to bring a mincha, then I require what's called Haggasha, but there's no requirement of Tnufa. Again, the only exception to that rule is going to be minchas knos, which is the case of a sota, when a man suspects his wife of immorality. That mincha will require both Tnufa and Haggasha, even though a minchas yachid only requires Haggasha without Tnufa. But in this case, although it's a minchas yachid, because it's only he and she that have this mincha, but nevertheless, it requires both Tnufa and Haggasha. Now, there's a complicated sheet of Rab Shimon. I don't think we're ready for this. He holds that any mincha that doesn't require kmitza, then by definition, it doesn't require Haggasha. And that's relevant to what's called minchas kohanim. As we'll see in minchas kohanim, there's no kmitza. Now, we have to establish the following two principles with regard to both Tnufa and Hagosha. First of all, these two avodos are not critical. That means that even in the absence of both Tnufa and Hagosha, the mincha is still considered b'di'eved a mincha ksher. It's l'mitzvah, we want both Tnufa and Hagosha. Second principle is that, and again, this, what I'm going to present to you is the Shitas HaTosfos, that Tnufa and Hagosha are ksheros bizarre. You don't need a Kohen, neither for the Tnufa nor for the Hagosha, because these are l'mitzvah. They don't strictly defined. They don't have the status or the classification as an avoda that requires Kohen. That's the Shita of the Balei HaTosfos. However, there's a contradiction between Tosfos in Masechta Menachos and Tosfos in Masechta Megillah. Tosfos in Masechta Menachos maintains that both Tnufa and Hagosha require kahuna. We expressed first the opinion of Tosfos Megillah that Tnufa and Hagosha did not require kahuna, and that ksher is bizarre. Then we have a third shita, and that's a third Tosfos in Masechta Kedusha. 3 different Tosfos. The shita of Tosfos and Kedusha is that there's a difference between Tnufa and Hagosha. Tnufa can be done by a zar. Hagosha requires a Kohen. So again, according to the two Tosfos that we started with in Megillah and Menachos, Tnufa and Hagosha is a package deal, inseparable. Either, as Tosfos Megillah holds, neither of them require a Kohen, an Ksher Bazar, or as Tosfos Menachos would have, they both require a Kohen. Tosfos Kedushin says that whereas Tnufa does not require a Kohen, but Hagosha does require a Kohen. Now again, at this point in our discussion, everything is kind of conceptual. We're using terminology here. For example, Hagosha. We haven't yet gotten to the point in which we'll define exactly what Hagosha is, how to implement it. But for that matter, we haven't even discussed Kmitza. That's first on our agenda. What exactly is Kmitza? So there are a number of questions that we have to address. Number one, where is Kmitza implemented? Number two, by whom? And number three, how? How do you do Kmitza? On the first question, everybody agrees that Kmitza, number one, requires Azara. You have to go into the Azara in order to achieve Kmitza. But number two, anywhere in the Azara is kosher for Kmitza. And here we have a contrast between Menachos and what we call Kodshim. Because Kodshim require what's called Tzafam. And the Shechita, etc., has to be done in the northern part of the Azara. With regard to Kmitza in Menachos, Azara is fine. Anywhere in the Azara is fine. We don't need Tzafam. There's no requirement of Tzafam. And this is derived in the Gemara in Menachos based on an equation to what's called Bezichen. And you may recall that every Shabbos, when they removed the Lechem Aponim from the Shulchan, they removed also the Bazichen, and that Levona, that spice, had to be burnt on the Mizbeach. And the halacha is that Siluk bazichen me'ashulchan, which is somewhat similar to kmitza, naseis ba'hecha, is done in the hecha. So therefore, although kmitza does not require heichal, but it could be done in the heichal. So imagine, on the one hand, we're equating kmitza with shchita, and insofar as the kometz has to be burnt, it's like kodshim, like an ola. It's not like shlamim. You should require tzafon, and yet we're being lenient, and we're lowering the madriga of kmitza and menachos in a comparison or vis-a-vis kodshim, and we're requiring tzafon. We're requiring azar, but not tzafon. But on the other hand, we are considering kmitza and menachos to be on a higher level, and as a result of the equation with the siluk habazichim, which takes place in the shulchan and the heichal, we could also implement the kmitza of the korban inside the heichal. Now, obviously, we're requiring a kohen because a zar cannot go into the heichal. But again, we never had an issue here. We never had a suffix about the fact that kmitza has to be implemented by the kohen. Okay. Now, what exactly is kmitza? How is it done? Let's see what we can figure out here. Now, we have mentioned in the past that the mincha is basically made up of a mixture of shemen with solas. But there's also a third element, a third ingredient in a mincha, and that's called levona. So the first thing we have to do before kmitza is we got to separate the levona. Make sure that the levona is on one extreme side of the kli, so that when the kohen does the kmitza, he doesn't add the levona to it. Because the kmitza has to be pure kometz without any admixture of the levona. So number one, in order to introduce kmitza, we say that the kohen misalik es halavona litzad echad b'toch hakli, so that the actual act of kmitza will not in any way scoop up any of the levona that's in the kli. He writes in the footnote, Kidei shelo tikametz, that's the verb for the active verb for kmitza, halavona v'yachanim amincha, sharei shaninu shem kamatz v'ola v'yado, srar o gror melach o kurt levona, pasul. If somebody could be kind enough to press that mute button. Again, I've tried it a million times, and it just doesn't work for me. So you have to do that yourself. Okay. So the Mishnah and the Gemara established that if in the kometz it's an admixture of anything, whether it's a pebble, whether it's some part of the levona itself, that passes the kmitza. And even if salt gets mixed in somehow to this kmitza of the soles, it passes the mincha. That's number one. Get the shovel the levona over to the side of the kli. Okay. Now we get to the real McCoy. Dochek estzide etzbos yad yamino l'toch hasoles. So we're talking about his right fingers, the fingers on his right hand that are going into the soles. Is it all 5 fingers? We'll have to see. B'makom shebo shmana meruba. we didn't discuss blila yet, but blila, which comes before kmitza, is when you add the oil into the solas. And when you add the oil into the solas, part of the solas becomes saturated or absorbed with the shemen, with the oil. That's called the shmena. That's already the thicker part of the solas. That's exactly where he does the komas. B'machnis kol yado, kol kaf yado l'soch. He places his hand with his fingers, and the entire palm of his hand goes into and is submerged into the solas blula b'shemen. And then, I was asking you before, which fingers is he using? To go into the solas, he uses all 5 fingers. But now that his hand up to his wrist is submerged in the solas, now, Mekapel es sholosh etzba'osov hemtsoyos uposhton al yad al kaf yod. What he does is now he folds his 3 fingers. I don't know the names of these 3 fingers. This one's a pointer, this one's a middle finger, and this one is called in Hebrew a kometz. I don't know what it's called in English. And then, after he has submerged his hand inside the solas, up to his wrist, he flicks these 3 fingers, and whatever part of the solas he catches between his 3 fingers and the kaf yad and his palm, that is the kometz. V'achakach hofech es gav yodo lemata kidei shelo yipol klum me'akometz. Oh, I got it. Sorry, let me rewind a little bit. He digs his hand into the solas, does the kmitza, and then he turns his hand upside down so that any extraneous part of the solas will fall to the right and to the left while he clenches his fingers tight against his palm so that he's holding on to the kometz. And that's called hofech es gav yodo. This is called the gav yodo, right? The flip side of the palm. Lemata. The gav yodo is now facing the bano. Again, unfortunately, I don't have a picture of it here. I have to get one of my picture books. But so far, I think what I told you is correct. Umotzio me'akli. Now he takes that kometz out of the kli. Shasoles bein etzba'osav l'kaf yodo. And that part of the solas is now trapped in between his 3 fingers and his palm. Now he uses his thumb and his pinky to get rid of or push aside all the solas that is not trapped between his fingers, or more precisely between his fingers and the palm of his hand. Now we have a different kind of mincha. We're not talking about solas anymore. He actually did the frying and the baking of the solas. It's already, like, for example, in minchas marcheshes, right? It's already been fried. So now he has like matzah pieces, and he does pirur, if you remember, and he breaks the matzah pieces into small pieces, like a farfel, like a powder. And then he does the kmitza, b'shalosh etzbos, b'psisei mincha, right? These little pieces of mincha. Masha bolek ne'apsisim, michutz lahem, mochek ba'gudel b'zeres. Exactly as we saw it before, except now it's baked already. Umafrida me'apsisim shebetoch etzbos, to separate with his thumb and his pinky that part of the psisim that is not trapped in his fingers. Umasha nisha betoch yoda li'achar mechika, and after he does this mechika, getting rid of all the parts that are not in his fingers, then what's left in his hand is the komets. And he quotes a brisa, also in Masech B'Yoma, that zui me'avodos hakoshos shebimigdash, that in the case of a mincha fuya that's already been baked, the pieces of matzah are very sturdy, very solid, and it's very hard with his pinky and his thumb to break off those pieces that are outside the etzbos. And that's called me'avodos hakoshos shebimigdash. It's one of three of the most challenging avodos. The other two are malika b'chatas ha'of and chafina of the ketores l'fnai v'l'fnin. But this avoda of komets, specifically of the breaking off those parts that are not inside his fingers, that's one of the big three avodos koshos shebimigdash. Now he has a shita of the Kesef Mishnah in the Rambam. I'm not familiar with this, that all five fingers are used in kmitza. Very strange. Now, how much is the minimum volume of the solas that is kmitza? On this, we have a machlokes between Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi and Rava, two Amoraim. According to one shita, ein komets b'pachos mishnei kizesim. Now, this proves to me one of two things. Either the Kohen had a very large hand, much larger than mine. All right, I'm a small guy, but still, how large is large? You know, did he play for the Harlem Globetrotters? I don't know. You know, that they hold the basketball in their hand. Or alternatively, it means that a kizayis is much smaller than what we think it is. It's literally an olive slice. Because again, how much of the komets can he get in here? He needs a minimum, according to this one there, of 2 zaysim. However, there's another opinion that a komets is less than 2 zaysim. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan and Abai. We don't know exactly what that shear is. What is the minimum shear of a komets according to Rabbi Yochanan and Abai? And we'll conclude our discussion of today with the suffix of the Gemara in Yoma, Daf Mem Zayin and Beis, with regard to solace that's trapped between his fingers. That solace that is trapped between his fingers and the kaf hayad, that is komets. What about that part of the solace that simply got trapped between his fingers? And the Gemara vacillates back and forth as to what the status of the solace bein hatzbos is. Is it considered komets or is it shirayim? And the Gemara concludes that therefore we should use kohanim shmeinim. We should have kohanim that are very fleshy, and the flesh of their fingers is so wide that there's no room for any solace to get trapped between their hands. So all the Achronim ask, well, what about the Anshe Mishmar? Let's say I'm a Kohen. Kohen is coming. But if I were a Kohen, now it's my turn to get the Avot. But I'm not a fat guy. So the Rishonim say that even if you're not fat, you should make sure when you do the Kmitza to keep your fingers so close, pressed one to the other, that there's no airspace for any of the souls to get trapped between your fingers. And all this is the procedure necessary for kmitza. And again, there's one opinion that the kmitza And the kometz doesn't include the soles that's between his fingers. So let's just make a note of where we got up to here. Okay, we're up to Likud Halavono. That in Mirz Hashem we'll pick up tomorrow.